many people were rather shocked to see a title go across the New York Times front page recently titled, "The Constitution is Sacred. Is it also dangerous?" The tagline says the following: "One of the biggest threats to America's politics might be the country's founding document." Now, many people were up in arms over this, and they rightfully criticized the New York Times, an American newspaper which uses the right to free speech, for daring to publish something that is so inimical to the values of this country. But then more pictures of similar titles began to surface on social media that read like the following. Number 1, the Constitution is broken and should not be reclaimed. Number 2, MAGA turns against the Constitution. Number 3, we had to force the Constitution to accommodate democracy, and it shows. Number 4, the Constitution won't save us from Trump. Number 5, is the Constitution obstructing American democracy? Number 6, let's give up on the Constitution. Number 7, the U.S. lacks what every democracy needs. And of course, number 8, the story of how Lincoln broke the Constitution, all from the New York Times. Every title I read from you was from the New York Times. Well, my friends, this is not simply an ill-conceived article that was published on a day that may have been a slow news day, nor is it merely the musings of one ideologue that happens to ascend to the high ranks of the commentary at the New York Times. These titles and the article that I first mentioned to you are downstream of a phenomenon that transcends political boundaries in America, but is uniquely toxic to our way of life and our political order, a phenomenon called anti-constitutionalism. And in this video, we're going to explore anti-constitutionalism. I'm going to explain to you its sources, its origins, some of its main arguments. I'm going to respond to the arguments of anti-constitutionalism, and then I'm going to give us a pathway forward to defend and bequeath the Constitution and its fruits for future generations. Before we get into that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary rooted in philosophy, then I encourage you to like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to help me get this message out there. Even if you disagree with me, it is very easy to swim in the ocean of agreement, but it is much hard and much more rewarding to have steel go against steel and be sharpened or refined by what the two things made together can do. And so I would appreciate all of you engaging, commenting, liking, subscribing, telling your friends, your family, your pets. I don't care. Thank you guys so much for helping me do this. And now please enjoy the video. So, anti-constitutionalism is a topic that we don't talk about enough in this country. In fact, most people just assume, rightfully so, that being against the Constitution means that you are against America and you should then therefore be written off. Now, the last part is where we have the problem, because no matter what position someone holds that shocks your sensibilities, you should never be dismissive towards different viewpoints, even absurd viewpoints, because sometimes the absurd and the cruel and the foul can give us a opening gateway into beauty, into truth, into order. Herbert Spencer said in First Principles that there is an iota of goodness in all things evil and an iota of evil in all things good. Everything has flaws, and everything is constituted in such a way that can allow us to learn several things by looking at something from a different lens. So Americans oftentimes do not interrogate people that criticize the Constitution, and we need to start doing that much more. But so anti-constitutionalism is both a left-wing and a right-wing phenomenon. Now in this video, we'll be discussing left-wing anti-constitutionalism because that is the ideology being used to justify these crazy New York Times headlines. That is the ideology that has been pushed in the public consciousness over the past 7, 8, 9 years, whether it be with the 1619 Project or whatever. This kind of a left-wing anti-constitutionalism is ancient, insofar as it has been around for a very long time, and its arguments are predictable and laughable. But there is also right-wing anti-constitutionalism, which we have to talk about as well. So I myself am on the political right. I am a constitutional conservative. But I see people on my own side of the spectrum, political spectrum, that also have antipathy towards the Constitution. There are 3 strains of right-wing anti-constitutionalism I think are very important for us to understand. The first strain, well, first 2 strains come from post-liberalism, Post-liberalism says that the very foundations of America, based on moral equality, based on individual rights, based on a kind of contractarian kind of government, a government that is built by consent, not by demand or tradition, this itself, they believe, is inherently flawed and creates a morally undesirable world. And so you may have seen various post-liberals talking about this kind of thing, whether it be Aaron McIntyre, Jerome Hazony. This crowd is against the Constitution from the outset, but they have a few arguments they like to use against the Constitution. Number one, just the argument that I just mentioned, they believe the Constitution itself is an accelerant towards the moral decay of society. They believe the permissiveness and the emphasis on freedom in the American tradition actually allows a vice, bad activities, to flourish. The second argument they oftentimes use is that they believe the Constitution itself is actually dead. You guys have may seen the popular video from Wayne's World, a guy that does like short videos on politics, where he basically says, yes, the Constitution is dead. And he goes into how several judicial rulings and some legislation that has been passed and several other events have essentially rendered the Constitution moot. It's rendered the Constitution wholly symbolic. He points to, for example, the dissolution of the separation of powers as brought about through the rise of the administrative state. Now, the problem with this argument is that while Wayne and people like him in the post-liberal right point out things that are absolutely wrong, and they point out things that are important to point out, and they do demonstrate that the Constitution is being attacked, they throw the baby out with the bathwater by refusing to recognize that the Constitution has a constancy. It is a constant in American history, that even in its weakest form, it is still a force for good. So no, it's not dead. It's on life to support, it's beleaguered, but it's not dead. Now, the third argument comes from the more libertarian side, and they will say that the Constitution is a force to centralize power and therefore direct society from on high. They'll go all the way back to the dispute between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and they'll say the Anti-Federalists had the right idea, and that the Federalists won, and therefore the Constitution from 1787 onward is an inherently corrupt document. I think this argument is one of the most ridiculous arguments I've ever heard. I'm someone who absolutely loves the Anti-Federalists, but I'm also someone that appreciates the dynamism of the American tradition. America was made great not by ideological purists. America was made great because people that had a similar ideological project in mind joined forces. Steel sharpened steel, refinement happened, and we didn't get a pure product in the Constitution. We got a good product in the Constitution. We got a well-refined product in the Constitution, and we got the best blueprint so far for human political organization. But it's not pure. There were, of course, problems. But the Constitution as conceived in 1787 is drastically different from how the Constitution is right now, because the Constitution right now has been amended, torn up, ignored, and completely discarded by several iterations of the Supreme Court, by several administrators that rule with the force of law when they're not able to do that. And so this would then lead us to believe, lead a reasonable person to believe, that you can't blame the Constitution for people stomping all over the Constitution. So that's right-wing anti-constitutionalism. And I'll address that more in a different video, perhaps, because I think that it's very important for those of us who love the Constitution to understand the arguments against the Constitution. But left-wing anti-constitutionalism, as reflected in those articles, is a much more pernicious force, because most conservatives love the Constitution, but many leftists absolutely hate the Constitution. Not only that, but they will devise arguments against the Constitution using their unwisdom. So let's look, for example, at that article I first mentioned, "The Constitution is Sacred. Is it also dangerous?" One of the arguments that this lady uses in this piece is that the Constitution can hasten the end of American democracy. She goes on to say that the argument that what ails the country's politics isn't simply the president or the Congress or the Supreme Court, but the founding document that presides over all three has been gaining traction, especially among liberals. Books and op-eds criticizing the Constitution have proliferated. Scholars are arguing that the Constitution has incentivized what Stephen Levetsky and Daniel Ziblatt call a tyranny of the minority. She is referring to a book written by Stephen Levetsky and Daniel Ziblatt called Tyranny of the Minority, How Democracies Die. And one of the excerpts from that book on their page where you go to buy it, says the following, and I quote, "They then show," this is talking about the book, "how our Constitution makes us uniquely vulnerable to attacks from within. It is a pernicious enabler of minority rule, allowing partisan minorities to consistently thwart and even rule over popular majorities." The description goes on to say, "Most modern democracies from Germany to Sweden have eliminated outdated institutions like elite upper chambers, indirect elections, and lifetime tenure for judges. The United States lags dangerously behind." In another article that is mentioned in that collage that I told you, "The Constitution is broken and should not be reclaimed," the author said the following: "After failing to get the Constitution interpreted in an egalitarian way for so long, the way to seek real freedom will be to use procedures consistent with popular rule." These arguments, my friends, go back to the progressive era, and they go back to two primary individuals who I'm going to talk to you about. I talked about these two in my past videos, but they're very important for today's video as well. Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Croly. Let me give you some background. Woodrow Wilson was obviously a United States president. He was an academic, a scholar. He is responsible for the enactment of the Federal Reserve. He is responsible for the growth of the administrative state. He provided the intellectual machinery for progressivism to continue its march throughout history. He provided this idea of the new nationalism as well, which embodied many of these notions. Then you have Herbert Croly. Now, Herbert Croly is one of the founders of the New Republic, and he is widely considered the intellectual grandfather of the progressive movement. And he wrote a book in which he said, and I'm going to get into the arguments here in a second, that the country that we want to see in America is not a country held back, I'm paraphrasing, by the Constitution, but one that serves the democratic interests. That is, the popular will, i.e., the will of the majority. So the emphasis for Croly was that, yes, just like what those authors just said here in the modern day, back then in the 1900s, he was saying the democratic interest, what benefits the whole, the common good, the majoritarian concerns must be political concerns. And so we'll get into that's why that's thought thinking in a moment. But Woodrow Wilson also had his own gripe with the Constitution. Now, Wilson was a constitutional scholar. He studied this thing like a biologist would study the anatomy of a frog. He studied it with precision and then misinterpreted it within his own Hegelian worldview. In a writing called Constitutional Government in the United States, which Wilson penned in 1908, Woodrow Wilson says the following about the Constitution. Quote, "The makers of the Constitution constructed the federal government upon a theory of checks and balances, which was meant to limit the operation of each part and allow no single part or organ of it to be a dominating force. But no government," Wilson says, "can be successfully conducted upon so mechanical a theory. Leadership and control must be lodged somewhere. The whole art of statesmanship is the art of bringing in the several parts of government into effective cooperation for the accomplishment of particular objects." He goes on to say, criticize the traditions that brought forth America. Quote, "The makers of the Constitution seem to have thought of the president as what the stricter Whig theorists," the Whigs were a political force in Britain, many of whose ideas showed up in the American founding, quote, "wished the king to be only a legal executive, the presiding and guiding authority in the application of law and the execution of policy. His veto upon legislation was only his check on Congress, was a power of restraint, not guidance. He was not empowered to prevent bad laws, but he was not to be given an opportunity to make good ones. As a matter of fact, he has become much more." And so Wilson's complaint here, and also in the New Freedom, is that the president is not given adequate power by the Constitution to rule for the good of the people, to exercise his power in a way that is expansive and administrative. In the New Freedom, which he wrote in 1913, a few years after this, Wilson says that we are under the laws of Darwin, not Newton, and the Constitution was built upon Newtonian principles. What he was trying to say there is that the Constitution is out of touch, it is distant, it is abstract built on these overarching things that have no relation to everyday life, whereas Darwin has a relation to how life is, life grows. Well, the problem is Darwin's theory takes place within the context of Newton's revelations. You don't have life without life being bound to gravity. You don't have life without inertia allowing us to live coherently. For those of you who remember the elementary physics class, this will all make sense to you. And so the three arguments that left-wing anti-constitutionalists tend to have are the following. Number one, they believe the Constitution is irrelevant to the day's issues. This is what Wilson would say. This is one of the reasons why the progressive era, the progressives were so determined to break down the Constitution and to reject it, because they believed that they could not address the concerns of working people, of folks who were experiencing certain kinds of ills that they deemed political authority was meant to have. Well, the answer to this argument is actually quite simple, and it's that the Constitution, much like the truth, is a document that embodies all-encompassing principles that it is up to us in society to understand and apply to our own life. If you understand that America is categorically a self-governing society, you will then understand the wisdom of the Constitution. But the problem is this. If you reject that all problems that are social problems are therefore problems that must be subject to self-governance and not distant governance exercised through the machinery of the bureaucracy, if you do not accept that premise, then you cannot possibly accept the Constitution's wisdom. And in fact, you will see the Constitution as a refutation of everything you believe. When you try to impose your own beliefs over reality, reality will seem the way you want it to seem. But when you accept reality for what it is, you will be able to appreciate what it has to offer you, even if you ultimately have a different perspective on it within that context. This is what the Common Sense School of Philosophy, headed by Thomas Reid and the Scottish, who influenced, of course, Thomas Jefferson and several other American founders, were trying to say to us. They were trying to say, just because you may think that the entire world is an illusion, there are certain things that I have to interact with, that if I don't interact with them, I have no knowledge of them. For example, if I never pick up a rose and smell a rose, I will never know what a rose actually smells like. Therefore, I'm actually experiencing touching a rose. America was built upon the same kind of wisdom in the broadest sense. But the progressives reject this because their entire worldview cannot conceive of a self-governing peoples, because self-governance is the domain of individuals, not the domain of communities or majorities. The second argument is that the Constitution is not useful if it does not evolve. Now, this is another thing that I think is quite interesting. Because as I mentioned, if the Constitution is meant to embody universal ideas, it is therefore then good for all seasons. But the Constitution does evolve when people decide to amend it. It can evolve in a negative way or in a good way. A Constitution that is best operating for a free society, in my opinion, will not evolve too much. And when it does evolve, it will evolve glacially within the constraints of both its history and its core ethos. But unfortunately, there have been progressives that have tried to make the Constitution evolve in their direction, whether it be with the Equal Rights Amendment, which basically would say women have the right to vote or whatever, as opposed to understanding that kind of stuff is already in the Constitution. There have been so many different movements to change the Constitution to fit social passions. The temperance movement, which was 100% a progressive claptrap, just absolutely horrible, going into businesses, destroying private property to stop people from drinking, they changed the Constitution to fit their idiosyncrasies. And what happened? You had a society where alcoholism that was not actually destroyed, it went underground. Then when it came back with a vengeance. The Constitution is not meant to evolve. And to be honest with you, society is only meant to evolve insofar as it changes members. New generations come. But if a society loses its core virtues and values, it can no longer evolve because it has no foundation upon which to evolve. The moment if you were to destroy a butterfly before it comes out of its cocoon, it has no ability to evolve. It still remain a caterpillar. That is the same kind of thing we're dealing with here. The third argument is that the Constitution is a reflection of a certain time, a certain place, of certain people. The document that I read to you, the first article that I read to you, basically said that the Constitution is burdened by its inability by the founders' inability to recognize the freedom of black people and women. That's what that article that I read to you said. The problem with that is also very simple as well. Things emerge from a certain time, but that does not necessarily mean that they will have the same effect they had in those times. Because while traditions or principles do not change, or they shouldn't change too much, times do change, and therefore principles must meet the occasion of the age while still maintaining their character, while still maintaining the consistency of their character. And the Constitution allows this, but the people must enable it to remain this way and not change it to fit their fancies. So as you guys see, left-wing anti-constitutionalism is based largely on sentiment, based largely on appeals to personal injustice, appeals to emotion, and also based fundamentally on a miscategorization of the Constitution and a misunderstanding of its very nature. The Constitution provides all people, all thinking people, all free people, all people in general, several virtues for us to reflect upon. The biggest virtue of which is restraining authority from being able to invade private society beyond the extent necessary meant to protect the individual's ability to live out his life peacefully. Is the Constitution perfect? No. Has it been violated? Yes. Do people still violate it? Yes. But these are not arguments against the Constitution. In fact, these arguments logically presuppose that these things should not be happening, and therefore it is incumbent upon us, a moral citizenry, a assertive citizenry, to rise up and correct these things, stop them from happening, and restore the Constitution to its former glory. Anything absent of this is, in my opinion, doing a disservice to the traditions that were bequeathed by our founders, and doing a disservice to the Constitution itself. Let not the Constitution be a fading memory, like a flame that dies down when it's deprived from oxygen. Let the Constitution be a guiding light to generations both current and future of the ingenuity of human reason, as applied to political organization, and of a blueprint that would permit a flourishing society against the odds of human history. That is what the Constitution truly is. And as conservatives here in this country, we ought to recognize that, and we ought to save it before it is truly lost, dead, and buried. On my watch, that won't happen. How about your watches? My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, and do whatever you can to get our messages out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.